Ahí quedó ya, thank yous.
Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a todo el mundo.
Hi, good afternoon and welcome everyone.
Mi nombre es Jen y mi compañera es Alexia y juntos formamos parte de una colectiva de justicia del lenguaje que se llama Antena Los Ángeles.
My name is Jen and my compañera is Alexia, and together we are part of a language justice collective called Antena Los Ángeles.
Hoy vamos a estar interpretando entre inglés y español.
Today we're going to be interpreting between English and Spanish.
La justicia del lenguaje incluye el compromiso de la presencia plena de todos y la capacidad de comunicarnos en nuestros idiomas.
Language justice includes the ability to show up as our full selves and also to support multiple languages in one space.
Quisiéramos comenzar reconociendo todos los idiomas presentes hoy aquí, mucho más allá del inglés y español, y especialmente los idiomas de los pueblos indígenas de esta tierra o la tierra en donde estemos.
So we want to start by recognizing the languages that exist beyond this space and also the indigenous languages that inhabit the land we're on.
Alexia y yo estamos en Los Ángeles, en territorio no cedido Tongva, donde el pueblo y el idioma Tongva siguen en resistencia.
Alexia and myself are in unceded Tongva territory where the Tongva language is very much in existence and resistance.
Hoy estaremos usando inglés y español activamente, así que las personas que prefieren participar en un solo idioma elegirán un canal de idiomas pronto.
So today we're going to be interpreting with the Zoom function. So whoever is not bilingual is going to choose a preferred language channel in a second.
Estaremos usando la función de interpretación de Zoom, que quizá algunos de ustedes han usado antes.
So we're going to be using the Zoom interpretation tool. Some of you might have used it already.
Para acceder a la función que ya está prendida, pueden o ver en su computadora un icono de un globo en el fondo de la pantalla, o si están accediendo a esta reunión por teléfono o por tableta, tendrán que pulsar más y acceder a interpretación de idiomas.
Oh, yeah. If you are accessing today via your computer, you're going to click on an icon in the shape of a globe that's at the bottom of your screen.
Y si están accediendo por teléfono o por tableta, verán, tendrán que pulsar más y acceder a interpretación de idiomas.
And if you are joining us via your tablet or smartphone, you're going to click on the button that says more or three little dots, and then on the drop-down menu, select language interpretation and then your preferred language channel.
Si tienen alguna dificultad con la interpretación, por favor, pónganse en comunicación con Juan en el chat y con muchísimo gusto recibirá ayuda.
If you have any issues with interpretation, please get in contact with Juan via the chat, and she would be happy to help you out.
Entonces, vamos a empezar a usar interpretación simultánea en este momento.
So we're going to start using a simultaneous interpretation right about now.
I'm going to start by doing a quick tech check. For folks who are listening on the Spanish, you should be listening to Alexia interpreting. I'm going to ask one of the panelists to just hop onto the Spanish and give me a thumbs up if you can hear Alexia speaking into the Spanish line. And I'm hoping that someone will be willing to click over there, someone who I can see telling me that they can hear Alexia on the Spanish line. And maybe Daniela would do me that favor. Okay, perfect. Great. Thank you. Y ahora estoy hablando en la línea en español y todo el mundo que no está compartiendo en este momento debería silenciar su micrófono.
So everyone who is not sharing language right now should be connected to a language channel.
Ahora me puedes escuchar, Alexia.
Así es.
A ver.
There you go.
Ok, vamos a seguir adelante rápido.
Okay, so we're gonna keep
Ojalá
going very
están
quickly,
escuchando a Alexia
hopefully.
en la línea del
Hopefully, people
inglés.
are able
Espero
to
que sí.
hear Alexia
Ok,
in the
muy
English channel,
bien.
I hope so. Okay,
Ahora, las
perfect.
personas que
Okay,
quieren
so now
participar a través de
whoever
un canal de
wants
idiomas debe estar en
to
su idioma preferido. Las personas que
engage
son
via a
bilingües en
language
inglés y
channel, you
español
should be
pueden mantenerse
able
en
to
el
do that
espacio
already.
principal porque vamos a
Bilingual,
estar usando
just
ambos
stay in
idiomas.
the main
Como
room
comenté, por favor silencien sus micrófonos cuando no
because we
estén
are going
hablando y
to
estén
be
pendientes
actively
de comunicaciones
using
en el
both
chat.
languages.
Por último, quisiéramos nada más comentar que las personas que nos entienden en español habrán notado que
Keep an eye
estamos
out for
usando la
any
terminación
messages
E
from the
en vez de
interpreters.
la tradicional A
Lastly,
u
we just
O.
want to
No es un
mention
error de
that whoever
pronunciación,
is
sino un
listening in
esfuerzo muy
English, you might have
intencional
noticed that we
de
are
romper
using
con el
the
binario
ending
de género y
E
de no
instead of
hacer
A or
asunciones
O.
acerca
That is
de
not a
la
mistake
identidad
or
de
an error in
género de
pronunciation, but a
nadie.
very
Sentimos
intentional
muchísima solidaridad y
and
amor
conscious
por
effort
Lace y
to
es un
disrupt
enorme
the
gusto
gender
estar acá
binary. We have
apoyando
so
este
much love and
espacio
solidarity
multilingüe.
towards
Muchas
Lace, and it
gracias.
is such a delight to be here supporting this bilingual space. Thank you so much.
Hola, bienvenidas a todas.
Hello,
Mi nombre es Daniela.
Welcome everyone.
Soy curadora en jefa y directora de programación.
My name is Daniela Liaja Quintanara. I'm a curator at Alays Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions. So before we get started with this event, I would like to honor
en las que nos
the indigenous people of this land with all of you, the land we are inhabiting today. And I start in Los Angeles, so these lands belong to the Tongva people, and they are the stewards and stewardesses of this land. We recognize their presence in this present moment, in the future, as well as in their ancestral past. And so traveling to the heart of America, the continent in San Salvador, where Abigail and Patricio are at right now, we recognize the presence of the Nahuas of Puscatan. More specifically, they've had also a very violent history of erasure. And then we go back here to the north
en Tijuana,
of Tijuana, where Liliana, where right now there is been happening in their sacred lands because an extension of the wall is being built, the imposed wall. So I would also like to recognize the immigrant people who have also been displaced from their lands. And here in Los Angeles, there is a vast diversity. We also respect and honor their resistance, and we stand in solidarity with them. So also I would just want to acknowledge and thank the artists here present today, Liliana, Abigail, and Arshia Haq. We are very honored here at Lace. So this event is organized by Lace, and whoever is not familiar with us, it is an art space. We've been around for over 40 years. It was founded in 1978 by artists and for artists. It is an emerging artist incubator of emerging curator incubators, but it is also a space where artists from multiple generations can get together, and we have a very deep connection with Latin America and Tijuana, and some connections with El Salvador, and more recently we have had the desire to continue this momentum and this connection. And now I would like to thank Yes Contemporary. It is we put this exhibition together, Borders of Freedom, curated by Patricio Majano. It's in collaboration with Yes, and I would also like to thank the Centro Cultural Tijuana, the Tijuana's Cultural Center, Bianca Santana, the executive director, Francisco Godínez Estrada,
exposiciones. Leo ha sido
Leobardo Garcia, the exhibition manager. Leo has been an ally and accomplice to build these connections among regions. I am very grateful to Jen Hoffer and Alexia Vecchia for their interpretation and their language justice work. And well, I leave you with Patricio. He's a curator, he's an artist, professor at the School of Arts, the Faculty of Arts at Salvador University. He's also curator at Yes Contemporary. And I would like to remind everyone you have the language selection at the bottom of your screen. If you haven't selected it, please do so. If you want
Muchas
to
gracias a todos.
access, let's get this started.
Muchas gracias, Daniela. Y de parte de Yes Contemporary y de la Fundación Robert Bennett y Mario Kaderfresh,
Thank you so much, Daniela. And we're so happy to be here at this chat. And as Daniela mentioned, we've been organizing together with LACE. And we also wanted to thank all of the other people and institutions who have supported us, who Daniela mentioned, including the Cultural Center of Tijuana and the Autonomous University of Baja California and its Department of Art. Yes Contemporary, which is also receiving support from the Robert Wennett and Mario Cader French Foundation, is dedicated to supporting Salvadoran artists in country and also in the diaspora. We do exhibition programs, and this particular one is called Borders of Freedom, Contornos de Libertad. And we are presenting this work right now in collaboration with LACE. This is a video exhibition, which is part of a program of works on loan on an international level, which allows a selection of work by Salvadoran artists to be loaned internationally, which is part of a collection called Mario Cader Fresh. Borders of Freedom presents the work of seven videos by 6 artists: Alexia Miranda, Zaire Quevedo, Guadalupe Maravilla, Fede Zulán, Crack Rodriguez, and Abigail Reyes. The videos that have been selected present different ideas of freedom, and they connect with intimacy and domesticity, spirituality, gender, migration, and the socio-political context. Together, these works approach freedom and consider ideas that these artists identify as limits, as well as the way that these can be addressed as problematics. We want to invite you to see the entire show, which is on LACE's website at welcometolace.org, and it will be available until December 15th. So you'll be able to go and see it. The online exhibition includes the videos, but before each video, there's a brief introduction by each of the artists, where they're able to go deeper about some of the content and ideas that they are working on in their pieces, as well as their relationship with different ideas of freedom. The exhibition's goal is to centralize the creative dialogue of Salvadoran artists, both within El Salvador and in the diaspora. However, the dialogue around these issues is not limited just to El Salvador, and of course extends beyond our borders. These dialogues are very relevant now more than ever. So for that reason, this talk titled Beyond Borders, what we wanted to do was to connect with other places and to talk about other thematics related to gender and freedom through the works of 3 artists, as well as the regions that they live in and their personal histories. I'm very pleased to introduce to you the artists Abigail Reyes from El Salvador, Arshia Haq from Los Angeles, and Liliana Hueso from Mexico. The works of our invited guests are nourished in different contexts, and they approach gender from different specific experiences. In each case, each artist has identified situations that limit their freedom or the freedom of others, including labor inequity, discrimination, colonization, violence against women, and more. Beyond Borders recognizes the importance of articulating these situations with the goal of making clear how terrible they are, and to invite reflection, deeper reflection around these themes in search of exchange and freedom among people. Throughout this conversation, you can also hang on to your questions, because in the final section of our chat, you're going to be able to speak directly to the artists and all of the panelists. And you're going to be able to do this using the option of Q&A that you should see at the bottom of your screen. So we're going to begin having a little bit of conversation with Arshia Haq about her practice. Arshia Haq was born in India. She now lives in Los Angeles, California. She works in film, visual art, performance, and sound. She is particularly interested in counter archives and speculative documentary, and currently is exploring issues of embodiment and mysticism within an Islamic context. Her work comes out of a number of different personae: woman, Muslim, migrant, citizen, and is conceptualized in feminist ways outside of Western frameworks. She's the founder of Disco Stan, which is a decolonial collaborative project focused on the cultural production of the region of the Southwest Asia and North Africa.
Thank you, Arshia, for being here with us tonight. And I will launch a question just to get us started. And then you can go deep into your practice. First, there's an interesting connection between your video, Romantic Scene, and Si Señor by Abigail Reyes, that is part of the exhibition Borders of Freedom, since both videos are derived from mass media films and TV. Romantic Scene is also a response to Removed, a film by Naomi Human. This video physically erases from the film the bodies of women from sexual assault scenes recurrent in commercial Bollywood films from the 70s and 80s. While this is a way of censorship, at the same time, it is highlighting an issue on the fact that violence against women has been normalized in these films. Can you tell us more about this work, and how do you address gender inequality through your art?
Thank you so much, Patricio, and to everyone at LACE and the other artists. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be included in this dialogue, because I do, in many ways, try to think about creating or exploring transnational, especially being from, between two places, if not more, and really thinking about kind of the porousness of identity and how fluid that can be. So this film, I actually was invited to speak about this particular project specifically in response to Abigail's project, in which she is recontextualizing the kind of almost casual appearances of women who are secretaries in telenovelas, and really putting these together to highlight the inequity and particular gendering of that role, and working with the archive and kind of these stereotypes of female roles within society. And for me, this project, Romantic Scene, was really, as Patricio mentioned, in response to a film that I had seen while I was doing my graduate work from one of my teachers, Naomi Human. And in 2019, I was invited to make a project again with film, which I had not physically worked with for almost 15 years. In the interim, I had been working with digital video. So this opportunity to work with the material in a really analog and tactile way brought back this desire to be in conversation with Naomi's film, which I had seen. the first still and the second still that we're seeing here are both from Naomi's films, in which she had taken basically pornographic reels from the 70s and 80s and taken out the bodies of the women frame by frame, hand painting bleach into the figure of the woman, which gives a kind of erasure, not completely, but creates this ghost-like figure in the frame. And removed is at times eerie, at times humorous, and it was just a film that I was kind of haunted by. So when I had the opportunity to work with film again, I wanted to kind of revisit some of the, and this is like a little gif from Naomi's film. I reached out to Naomi and, told her of this desire to work with a similar technique in exploring the films that I had grown up with, which were films from Bollywood, and which there are until the mid 90s, but even more recently, there's like this trope of having a scene of sexual assault or rape, which is very titillating. It was in almost every film, or meant to be titillating. It had this kind of its own language, and it was something that we were just exposed to all the time. And I really, thought a lot about how it was normalizing a kind of violence. As we know and we've heard in the news, India has been the site of a lot of horrific misogyny and sexual violence at a pretty market scale. And so I wanted to work with that footage that I had grown up with and use a similar technique. So the film kind of progresses through, starting with some of the more typical gaze towards the woman, and then the film degrades throughout as it progresses. And I start to use some of the technique of the bleaching. Some of these subtitles or these translations are actual lines from the film. And the reason I called this film Romantic Scene is because actually this form of sexual violence was the only form of any sexual expression that you would see on screen. There was nothing that was kind of more pleasurable or consensual. It was always this act of violence, because the actual act of consensual sex had been banned for several. So for me, this was just a way to kind of process this material and work through the ubiquity of these scenes. And so these are just some frames. I think we are going to actually also put in the chat a link to the film, and I'll for a few days if anyone wants to see that. But yeah, so for me, it's really working, with the archive in this way to kind of, in a really simple gesture, draw attention to this this particular form of violence that is there in front of us at all times and is kind of just ignored or taken for granted.
Thank you, Arshia. I would like to talk about another work, The Second Coming of Fatima, which addresses religion, tradition, gender, history, and colonization. Can you tell us more about that piece, and why are these themes relevant in your practice?
Yeah, it's interesting. I never really think of myself as explicitly setting out to make work about female subjectivity, but it kind of happens because I've been thinking a lot about a quote from Saidiya Hartman, which talks about autobiography and how that's a lens for how we understand greater political and social forces. So it naturally happens. I'm also, when I was thinking about these works, there's a lot of fragmentation and dismemberment. you know, in the sense of the women being removed from the Bollywood films. And then this work, which really for me was from a show last year. It was the first time I was working with sculpture and installation in this way. It really came from a response to first, you know, experiencing artifacts or stolen colonial wealth in the context of Western museums, and specifically around the idea of partition, which was the division of India and Pakistan in the middle of the 20th century. It was probably, it was actually one of the biggest forced migrations in history. Millions of people died in this transition and arbitrary creation of two countries. And women, of course, you know, suffered a lot of violence in this history, in this making of this history. But I was really specifically thinking about going to museums and seeing jewelry from India, from Pakistan, behind glass, and you know, jewelry is traditionally handed down between women, and this whole history kind of gets interrupted by the theft of these objects. And for me, I was kind of thinking about, you know, the actual bodies of the women as the objects that are worthy of reverence. And so the throats in the installation were taken from women from both sides of the border. There were several countries involved in partition, but from my personal history, India and Pakistan are the two countries that I'm most conversant with. So the casts were made were from my own body, and also from a friend who's from Pakistan. And also in this piece, you know, the whole gallery was covered with dirt, because I was really thinking about this, you know, idea also when we walk into a museum, how sanitized the spaces are, and how we don't really think about the history of how an object got to be there and all of the violence that might have been part of that. And so having the dirt and forcing the spectators to walk through it was in a way making the audience complicit, or at least more aware of that kind of soil of history that these things emerge from.
Thank you. And also, in your performance, Strangers Union, that was presented at LACE last year, you address alienation and inclusivity, specifically alluding to the Southwest Asia and North Africa diaspora. Um, this performance, like I said, took place in Los Angeles, the state with the largest immigrant population in the United States. Can you tell us more about this piece and why you were interested in this interaction with the Los Angeles environment?
Yeah, so this is one of the more joyous or celebratory pieces in my work. So the first image that we saw right before this was, it's kind of like a classic, like one of the top 40 hits. It's an image of the Prophet and ascending on Burak, a religious image. And what's remarkable for me in this image is that the figure with the most power is not seen. So is not able to be drawn or represented. And this is something that I really grew up with, because I did grow up with a lot of Islamic theology and tradition, this idea of representation kind of being something that's an impossibility and can only ever be an approximation. And in this current moment that we're living in, where everything's seen, you know, we have access to so many things, so much visual information, yet it's this moment also where things are not registered. You know, we see this with the violence of, you know, the police assaults against Black bodies, where everything is recorded, but you still don't have this, the evidence doesn't really seem to translate into action. And So I started to think about invisibility and power. And so this particular performance had also had kind of a basis in this practice of putting freeway signs up. And I would put these signs up and in English and in Urdu to get, kind of like the fuck Trump or no ICE signs, but kind of more abstract messages. And the Urdu signs would get taken down right away because the script of Urdu or Arabic has a connotation of fear for people here. So the idea of this procession was to bring these scripts, these messages into this parade, basically down Hollywood Boulevard. It's called Ajnabi Milan, which means strangers union. Ajnabi is the word for stranger or alien. And when you first come as an immigrant to the US, when you have your green card, you're called a resident alien. So it's kind of playing on this idea. The sign actually had a quote from the Bible, which was, "I was a stranger and you welcomed me," which really was thinking about, kind of the right wing here really trying to build walls. This was, the practice of putting the signs up started not long after Trump's election, the first or the last time. So it was really just kind of thinking about this message of inclusion, but in this surreal way, and especially walking down Hollywood Boulevard, where so much of the mythology around America and being American is created in Hollywood itself. So to kind of insert this other vision of subjectivity in this procession was an intervention. And we had drummers, we had music that was played from our weddings, from our funerals. There was also part of a mix by one of the performers, the Sand Ninja. Everyone that was in the performance was from the diaspora of South and West Asia and North Africa, which I talk about together because of our shared pre and post-colonial history. So we started, kind of near the freeway and marched, and then came back to Lace and installed the signs there as kind of the culmination of the procession.
Thank you so much, Arshia. And I invite all the people to see the videos that are available in the chat. If you want to see more also about Arshia, you can visit her website. And I would like to connect that with Liliana Hueso's work. Liliana, muchas gracias también por estar acá.
Thank you so much for being here. And I am going to go ahead and introduce you. Liliana Hueso is a queer, binational, bilingual professor. She is an educator. She is a media producer. She's a photographer and an activist. Liliana has a vast experience in teaching and putting workshops on photography and media. She works independently in both sides of the border of Mexico and the U.S. Her work has been shown at different binational conferences, galleries, and events on film. She's a passionate of social justice, and through her photography and videos, she touches upon themes that visibilize segregated groups, especially themes of women and the LGBTQ community. As an artist in the borderlands, her work maintains a perspective that is shown through the quality of her photography and the imprinted histories. And in this occasion, I would like to talk about your work under a documentary photography, Lenchas and Marimachas, that is photographing queer women that are represented from the masculine but identify themselves as women. So could you tell us how this project was born? Of course, yes, Patricia, thank you so much for the invitation, for being here today. And also Abigail and Arshia, thank you so much for sharing the space today as artists. So basically the project The Lenchas y Marimaches project takes place
aquí en Tijuana, hace ya
where I'm going to grad school right now in Tijuana. So it was a necessity of exploring myself. I should also say that before I lived in Tijuana, I lived in San Francisco, California for almost 12 years. And it was the time that I came back to live in Mexico and TJ in Tijuana, that I had never lived in Tijuana before. I had lived in Guadalajara. I'm actually from Guadalajara. I lived there for many years. So I get to Tijuana, and it was a really big cultural shock because of my identity and the way that I present myself. It was an internal shock as well. It was a very harsh internal shock. So Mariachas, Leches y Mariachas originates from this effort to calm this visibility and also invisibility that I had, or that I was a witness of in this country, that was very different than the one I was observing at when I was living in San Francisco. So precisely, it comes up as a necessity of flipping the lens to myself and to women that represent themselves as me as well, like trying to represent people and bodies that otherwise would be invisible. They are not part of a collective
un poco
imaginary,
crear como
and also wanting to create in a way this imaginary, not normalizing it, but yes, wanting to explore the different identities that exist within diversity itself of the LGBTQ community, especially in women,
proyecto.
right? So it was right there when the project starts, and from there it just keeps moving forward. These images are a part of the first series that I started to photograph. The idea was to have some images that had a studio, like a photographic studio aesthetic, in which we were represented in our identity in a dignified way, in a way that a diversity would be able to
Esta
be
creencia
present, and a little bit trying to break with this belief that a lot of people have, that when you know one lesbian woman, you know all of them, right? Or like in the moment that you visibilize one, you're saying, oh, it's all of them. But no, there's a very large, a very wide spectrum of women there that, we have very diverse representations as well.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much. So you mentioned this project
A este grupo de
is
personas.
seeking to
Ya
visualize
es
this
estereotipo
group
presente
and rejecting the stereotypes that are very prevalent and present in Latin America, where obviously machismo and the patriarchy and heteronormativity is very prevalent. Why is this visibilization so important to you?
la principal idea de esta
Well, I think that the main idea for this representation and the reason why it's so important is precisely what I mentioned, right? To break, disrupt with this idea that there is only one way to represent us, right? Like we mentioned, there is different bodies, different ways of representing said bodies. I do not want to, well, say this, I don't want to normalize, but I want to create images that represent us with dignity. And through creating this visibility, we are opening a pathway or a way for future generations, for them to represent the such diverse spectrum that exists within the community. And a lot of the conversations that I have with the women that I've photographed have to do with the experiences that we've shared, perhaps. We come to these conclusions, to these ideas about the ways of how we're being
nuestra sociedad.
seen, how we're being gazed within our society or culture or own community, and the other ways in which we're invisible is specifically, like you say, like in a community, if the community is machista, the fact that a woman has a little bit a more masculine aesthetic or visibility, like you're more accepted, right? But within that acceptance, there's limitations because it is also creating this concept of understanding that not just we're being represented in the way that we are being represented, we want to become or be man or a male. So I'm trying to do a lot of creating different representations. I'm also trying to educate the spectator that's not part of a community, the spectator that is outside of the LGBT community, of seeing other images that are representative or representation of us. So I think that that is pretty much the importance of these images, of visibilizing us and telling our own stories through them.
Gracias.
Thank you.
¿Cómo es tu relación con esta?
And
¿Cómo
what is your relationship to these people, to these women? How do you come up to them and ask to photograph them? Well, the project honestly started with a lot. I was scared because as a photographer trying to engage in this project, obviously there is a lot of doubts. Get doubtful of, you're thinking that if whatever you're feeling is actually important in terms of visibility or representation, and you wonder if that replicates within other people or other folks. So I was scared to reach out to folks that were close to me and trying to explain what the project was about, and little by little I started to we started to connect. We built trust with like the women that I was working with, and they were like, oh my god, yes, let's do this, it sounds amazing. So it was reaching out and describing the project. So at the beginning I was doing this like photographic studio, like aesthetic like sessions, and then after that I started to open up the photographic spectrum and creating these images that you're looking at right now, that is more or less like mundane images about like the daily life. And I tell them that I want to represent who they are in their own private life, in their homes, in society, and how is that they integrate within society. So that's how this happens. Like you're looking at it right now. This is one of the women. She is a police officer here in Tijuana. There is another one. This one actually, she drives a truck. Their family is an international business. There's another one. She is an art student. So with each one of them, I just wanted to represent these elements that that represented them aesthetically, and just building this spectrum or this fan of identities and visibilize them in this way from whatever they bring to society or whatever they do. And during this same conversation, either via chat or phone, before we did the sessions or during the sessions, like you start to this understanding of, if I am part of this community, so I identify with these stories, very similar stories, sometimes with experiences, personal experiences from cutting our hairs. And where do you go to cut your hair? How do you like to wear your hair? What's your hairstyle? And also experiences, both the positive and the negative that we've had. And also getting to the point of our outfits. Where do you buy your outfits? How do we dress ourselves in this kind of thing that we might feel like an affinity when you're talking about them. And I think from there, it's just been snowballing, that it's been growing and growing because one
the people who might want to be part of the project, and they are going to have more trust because they see themselves in me. And it's been something really wonderful to me. It's been a really great gift of this project to feel the support and closeness for with the community in the moment of being represented. A lot of times for me, in the moment that I contact someone and they say, "Oh yeah, how great. Yeah, I know about your work. I know about your project." And so the moment that I go to meet with them to take their photograph, I realize that they're excited to form part of the project, and just as I'm excited that they will form part of the project. So it's a wonderful dynamic of sort of nourishment for me to know that this is something really important. This visibility, it's not just important to me, it's important for the women who are part of the project itself.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Y
And
bueno, la ciudad de Tijuana está ubicada en la
well, the
frontera
city of
entre
Tijuana is located on the Mexican border, the border between Mexico and the United States. This is a place that has huge socio-political and cultural importance. How does your work respond to that context? Well, I think that primarily it's been like a concern for finding people who will fit within this representational context. So as I mentioned a little while ago, I'm originally from Guadalajara. I went to high school and university there, and I go to live in San Francisco. After a number of years, I went back to Guadalajara with a more masculine appearance. I was a little bit more sure of my own identity, and I felt more comfortable with who I am. And I get to Guadalajara, and I found that shock of rejection in my own community, that shock of rejection, like of people saying, what's up? You're really obvious. You're really masculine. And I started to receive like comments, like maybe almost a little bit negative and a kind of rejection. And I was carrying that experience with me. I go back to San Francisco. I lived more years there. Then I came back to Tijuana again. Well, I go to Tijuana to live, and I received a completely different reception or different treatment. There wasn't such a strong hostility toward me. It was a way of more like maybe some looks, but just to understand, who am I? Am I a guy? Am I a girl? And I think that a lot of people try to see, they try to understand, what box can they put me in, because you sort of fall outside that spectrum of normativity of what people expect, that you're a woman or you're a man. So I the way that I was treated was very, very different. So I started to document through these images. What I started to document was interesting for me to see and get to see the experiences of other women who sometimes come to Tijuana, and within the community, within the culture of Tijuana, because of course it's border culture and it has influence from the United States. A lot of times there's maybe a little bit broader perspective that we accept who we are and how we are, precisely because I think it might be because of the influence of the United States, and because people are raised in that same culture and the same social and cultural structure. It's very different from what I experienced or what I perceived in Guadalajara or other cities in the center of Mexico specifically. So I started to talk with these girls also, and we started to share our stories. Just that a lot of them are not from Tijuana. They've come to Tijuana because of just the vagaries of life or because of the qualities of Tijuana or who knows, but that they feel more comfortable in Tijuana, seeing themselves represented, but also being able to dress in the way sort of outside of the norm, outside of the normative, or ways that might be more thought of as more masculine. So this is a context, maybe an ideal context, where there's a mix of cultures, and that this allows for the creation of maybe a more expansive environment. Sure, there's a lot of room for growth still, there in terms of our acceptance or identity, becoming more visible in all of the ways that we exist. But it's we're headed that direction in that sense, and the project is about that as well. Thank you so much, Liliana. And now we're going to turn to our last presenter, Abigail Reyes. Abigail is a visual artist and poet. She has done individual exhibitions at the Art Museum of El Salvador, Marte, Poporopo Alternative Project in Guatemala City, Guatemala, the Locus Contemporary Art Gallery in Medellin, Colombia, Galeria Extra in Guatemala City, among many other places. She lives and works in La Libertad, El Salvador. She created a series of telenovelas for her work, Sí, Señor, which is part of Borders of Freedom, in which she questions the hierarchical order in which the secretary is presented as a passive subject in relationship to her authoritarian boss. Thank you so much for being here, Abigail. And okay, we're going to start talking about the two pieces that are included in Borders of Freedom. Sí, señor, yes, sir, and ser secretaria, to be a secretary. So they're part of a much more extensive body of work that's about the exploitation of secretaries in El Salvador and Latin America in specific. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the process was of creating these works? Hi, good evening. Thank you so much to everyone for being connected, and thank you so much to Liliana and Arshia for sharing this space with me. So in reality, when I started this project, I began, the videos were a sort of a broader work, and I wanted to do some works for screen because it would be flatter, actually, because this had to do with the way people developed the skill of being secretary. So this piece is from 2014, the entire piece called Plana. But over the years, maybe in 2015, 2016, I started to focus on other things that interested me. I started doing other research. I actually had studied to be a secretary, and I had worked as a secretary for 2 years. I also was sort of ending that job to try to understand what lines of thinking would be more interesting to me. So textbooks as a creative source, to also think, for example, before I started making the videos, how might I work in other disciplines outside the schematics of specifically a secretary as a secondary subject in terms of role plays. So this was clearly linked to questions of gender, because who gets to have an assistant, or an assistant who's below you, or who's ever heard of a male secretary, a male receptionist? You're hardly ever going to see that. Maybe now it's more common, but when I was studying, and still it's rare to see a man playing those roles. So that's where I sort of started. And for these pieces specifically, I was making a list of all of those disciplines: literature, magazines, music also. There are so many songs that talk about secretaries. movies and soap operas, right? So particularly, I was interested in songs. I have a playlist. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. But also I was really interested in the soaps, the telenovelas, because they have such a deeply rooted cultural influence in Latin America. The telenovela as a genre in itself arose in Latin America. There were radio novels before there were telenovelas. I think in the 40s they started. And there are the telenovelas that were made initially in Brazil in the 50s. So this is a cultural practice that's deeply rooted in Latin America. So for those reasons, I wanted to work with telenovelas. And they're also a means of mass communication that belongs to popular culture. It's part of popular culture. So I did a giant review of telenovelas and to look at all of the principal characters, the lead characters and their secretaries. And well, so for the video called Si Señor, I was particularly interested in what happens or what do we see in terms of how secretaries are educated. It has a lot to do with repetition, discipline, almost a military discipline. So I cut out all of the parts of the telenovelas that I saw, and where the boss is giving the secretary an order, and she's responding, "Yes, sir, sí, señor." And there's another thing that interests me, and that's that in some moments you almost would laugh seeing this video. It's like 4 minutes long of all of this thing, but suddenly to experience other sensations, makes you a little bit angry. It makes you a little bit indignant when you get into the second or third minute of this video. And one of the things that I really wanted to paint a portrait of in this video is the idea that there's a body language that what maybe even if she's saying "sí, señor," yes, sir, her body language is saying something else. And as a tool or a point of resistance also. And for the video called Ser Secretaria, to be a secretary, this part of the research was mixed in where I was interested in understanding ways that women resist the hierarchical structure, but I was also interested in understanding how we might visibilize and give a little bit more voice to women who live in real life and working as secretaries for 15 years, for 30 years. Some of the secretaries or one of the women who collaborated with me had worked as a secretary for 30 years. That's a lifetime. Her kids, her family, everything that she's been able to do has been through this work. But she's also experienced many things. The episodes of abuse of power, sexual harassment, etc. So I was interested in learning more about that part, because there's a huge stereotype about secretaries, which is she's easy, she's just there to support her boss, but there are other voices that deserve to be heard. So in this sense, I did small interviews with them. They weren't huge. They were just 4 or 5 questions. Some extended longer because we gained trust or because they wanted to share their experiences more. But one of the questions always was, what did it mean to them to be a secretary? Because there was always a boss. There's always a boss giving a description or a meaning, I guess, of what it is to be a secretary. So I also wanted to know, what does it mean to be a secretary when you've been doing it for 30 years or 15 years? So the video has some of the content it has a little bit, a short moment from the telenovela where the boss is telling the secretary what it means to be a secretary, and what a woman who has worked for that long in reality says it means to be a secretary. So there's a kind of juxtaposition of content around the idea of what it means to be a secretary. But also, since I didn't have access to the workplaces of these women, I said, please, with whatever a device you had, any kind of phone or whatever, could you please make a recording of your daily workplace? And so that part is the visual part that we have with the voiceover when the women are talking on the video. So there's a juxtaposition around their their working conditions. And yeah, that's where those pieces are headed. And we're also seeing some other images which are part of this body of work, which has to do with the secretary's area of labor, which are based in, for instance, work trackers for an entire year, or what all of the things that are necessary to be a secretary. You can't be older than 35, or you have to be a certain height. And the requirements that are specifically about secretaries' bodies or about women's bodies and what you have to do to be able to do this work. So it was a year's worth of ads looking for secretaries. So more or less, that's where the work is headed.
Muchas gracias. Y bueno, mencionaste
Thank you
que
so much. And well, you mentioned that this body of work was originated from your own experience in that sector, in that kind of work. Could you
tus propias experiencias
expand on how your own personal experiences are reflected on your work at a maybe like a broader level? Yes. I actually feel that a lot of my work has to do with my own experiences, right? That is the starting point. And from there, well, that is a starting point. And for example, the works that are born from that, I think that everything is really permeated by everything that I was living through at the moment. For example, the flat piece that is a repetition of the same line on a piece that I think is around 30 meters in length. It is a written text with a typewriter. That's actually the typewriter that I used when I was in school, or is very manual work. And the text is kind of a pattern that is used to all the students in the secretarial school, and how to use every finger on the board, the keyboard. That's one part, but I'm also talking about how this is a system that's based on repetition, and you kind of set aside the sensibility, the aspects of sensibility and critical thinking. And for example, also so in this piece particularly, the one that we're looking at right now, that it is a repetition of what I was talking about, all the requirements to give to get hired as a secretary, like as a job. I don't know if it's too confusing, but for example, since I wasn't able to go to college right after I graduated high school, I worked as a secretary for a couple of years. So to be able to get that job, I looked at the paper. No, so it comes from like a very surreal experience of like how crazy these requirements are, just to be able to apply. And like this piece, so if the requirements said, I don't know, she must be 165 in height, 1.65 meters in height. So the piece is a sheet of paper that's 50 centimeters, in which I start typing with my typewriter, with my manual typewriter, 1.65 in height, 1.65 in height. But as the text goes on, I am omitting the vowels and the text is losing meaning. So it's kind of a mantra, you know, it doesn't have any meaning. It means nothing of what's being asked for you to get a job because you know the educational requirements there is like a pressure for you to know how to use this machine and then you're using this to type things that might be like too personal, you know, like related to your boss, you know, like in real life, they're asking, you know, you must be slender. You must be 165 as a requirement to get a job, to get that kind of job.
Muchas gracias, Abigail.
Thank you so much, Abigail.
También me gustaría hablar
I would also like to talk about migration
salvadoreños
that
que se van.
it is affecting the Salvadorian population disproportionately, both the ones that leave and people that stay there. Could you please tell us how this has affected you at a personal level and how this has made an influence in making artwork, like the one that you created for the second performance festival, Reunión? Yes. For example, the piece that the one that we're looking at right now, To Leave to Arrive, I was talking about this one before the talk that this is so this has to do with migration starting from my own personal experience. So I have not been forced to leave the country, but people very close to me have, brothers of mine and close friends. So when I started to think about this piece that
en el que la estadística decía que
it's about so like the statistics that a newspaper published that from every three Salvadorians, two wanted to leave the country. So it was 2014 when this research was conducted. There was also a lot of internal displacement here in El Salvador. The violence that the gangs are at fault for. So there were gang members that were moving internally in the country, but also those people didn't really have a lot of options of where to go to. So this translated to a lot of migration, or a period that migration was a much more stronger or more prominent than what it usually is. And and they left to the US for the most part. So this made me think about precisely this story about immigration and how this affects us, you know, like the ones that leave, yes, but also us that stay. So it also made me think a sister of mine that migrated. I never met her. She died in the US and I never met her, but you know, my dad used to talk about her a lot, so her memory still lives in my family. And also my other brother that obviously we all knew him, but I hadn't seen him in 16 years. I didn't know his children. So Beatriz Cortez extends an invitation to me, and this is where all this the whole reflection is born of what it means to migrate in within El Salvador, primarily by foot, and you were saying por tierra, by land, to talk about a way of migrating that's not legal. So we decided to write these words to arrive with soil, with land. In one of the university's galleries where the intervention took place, and how these two words written in the infinitive, how it makes us think about the back and forth about these journeys that take place, and how also barriers also exist more so for political reasons than for anything else, really. And it's this piece, that's what it's about, more or less. And this image that we're looking at right now, this is a part of a performance that I did in Honduras at the beginning of the year. It has to do with this question, this matter of migration. That this was because of the conversation that I had with one of the people that came with us. Anapala is an island in the Fonseca Gulf. It has connections with El Salvador. And this was a man who used to come with us in the different beaches, in the different journeys, because it was a big group of Central American artists that got together. So you know, they all did like their own actions in different places, and he used to come with us. So in engaging in dialogue with him, he started to talk to me. He told me his personal story, his family history, and he had migrated to the US with a small child, and then he had another kid there, but the family eventually ended up separated because he was deported, and the child that was also born there, I'm sorry, in Honduras, and that had migrated when he was very tiny. And one of the things that we had this sensation, and like in another parts that I've been to that are not necessarily in islands, there is this feeling of like a space of asylum. So he used to tell me that when he went back, he felt that he didn't belong in Honduras, and the kid that had gone to the US when he was very small, when he was young, he felt that the place where he was born and it was not his place, but also in the US he had been treated as if that wasn't his home either. You know, he didn't have like so the piece uh became that sensation, just like became this phrase. It's difficult to return because it's difficult to return to the place where you were born, where you belong to, because one of the optimal parameters or conditions to be able to make a life or to build a life with the opportunities that you have. But it's also hard to go back to the US or to the country from which you were deported, because it is not necessarily your place, but it also the piece is talking about or alluding to that sensation of not belonging to a place. So what I did is I took a log, the ones that the sea drags. So I took it and I carved that phrase. It is difficult to return, with the help of two artists. With two artists, they helped me carve the log. And then we brought the log back to that same island, to that same beach. It was called Isla Exposición, Exposition Island. So it's a really nice place to make art. And I took the log there and just I waited for the tide to drag the log back. And like local people told me that the log was probably or most likely going to end up in El Salvador. So it was very interesting to think that there are interconnected histories to this journey that a lot of people partake on or are forced to do. Thank you so much, Abigail. And well, this moment, we're going to open up the space for questions. You can ask anything, ask the panelists. To the bottom of your screen, you'll see a function, a Q&A function.
Y bueno, vamos.
And okay, so we're gonna give a moment for people to write their questions down. Okay, so here's a question here.
Daniela.
From Daniela. And this is for all three of you. So your work contains a criticism towards gender and to women's position in society and being queer in our social context. I would like to know, what is your experience as a women artist, a queer artist? It is working in the contemporary art world.
Bueno, es una pregunta para las tres, así que...
So it's a question for all of you. So whoever wants to go first.
Puedo iniciar si gusta.
I can start.
Creo que mi experiencia ha sido
Personally, I think that my experience has been
porque es interesante
a little complex.
queer o cuando eres artista
When you are an artist or a queer artist or a lesbian, a woman, a photographer, and my project is about
también
subjects that speak about myself as well. I think that it is there.
en la que
There is a thicker layer there in
pero
which
al mismo
I don't want to stay necessarily, but at the same time, I really want to visibilize it. I want to make it visible. So I think that it's double the labor, creating visibility in these communities that are outside of the LGBTQ community in my own projects because of who I am. And because a lot of the time people, I don't think there are spaces in which people can understand these images if a space is not a part of the LGBT community. So in that way, I think that it's been a challenge opening up these spaces that that don't exist within the community. And this is one of the strongest challenges that I face.
ahora con la pandemia
And I think something else right now, because of the pandemic, I have been modifying and creating within the project something that I call lentas y marimachas en casa, at home. So I've been calling it to the possibilities in different parts of Mexico, so we can document people from the LGBT community in this experience, in this pandemic experience. And within that spectrum, I've had a lot of openness in building connections clearly with other LGBT communities in different parts of the country. So I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword that in a way, I think it's opening, me being a lesbian opens up a lot of doors in creating a project that represents the community that I'm part of, but the other way, it's not opening spaces in which and that I could be educating the audience with in this imaginarium or these images.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Ahora, Arshia o Abigail.
Arshia or Abigail,
Hablar un poco.
would anyone like to speak a little bit about that question?
I can speak for a couple of minutes. So for me, it's been an interesting journey making work from a specific kind of immigrant identity, which was fairly young in the U.S. You know, I am an immigrant here, and you know, there have been people coming for some generations, but in terms of making art or being an artist from that community, I don't think we really had, even when I first started 15 years ago, there wasn't such a big community of artists from the regions that I'm from working in spaces, in mainstream spaces. And that's been something that's really changed in the last few years. So that's been an interesting shift. for me, it's always a question about, and it's not a question that has a defined answer in terms of who am I making the work for? And, you know, for me, it's first I make it for myself, really, to kind of explore my relationship to a particular issue or problem kind of that I'm trying to work through. And then, you know, it's for the community that I'm from. And so at times I think it has been difficult because I don't always like to translate or to explain everything. It's not my job to be an educator on these issues, which can also create a bit of alienation. But again, it also comes back to maybe this idea of the strength or the power in that which isn't translated or that which isn't said. And so that's kind of where I continue to return to in terms of how I work.
Gracias. Y Abigail, si hablar un poco sobre esta
Thank you,
pregunta.
Abigail. If you'd like to talk a little bit about this question, I think we have another question after that. Okay, well, for me, my experience working, because I don't have such an extensive trajectory, but my first projects were maybe in 2011, something like that. I've always lived in El Salvador, so though we might say I have had experiences of participating in a couple of residences outside the country, and it's also seen the work of women artists is seen differently elsewhere. But I think that particularly in the context where I am, which is a little bit smaller, for me, it's been really interesting, super interesting, because in El Salvador, there have been women who've made very important changes. So there's an active and very strong participation, for instance, Julia Diaz, or other women who've done very important things in our society. And I feel of I other artists who are working, and I don't know if this is what was intended with the question, but there are other artists who are women who've been working and or are working at the same time, and I don't feel like there's sort of an issue of corporeality and seeing the work of, I don't know, the art world, as a way to say it, or of our vocation, that there's a really interesting impulse to visibilize the work of women artists. And in my case, for instance, particularly, I often think a lot about having a commitment with my work is having a commitment with myself and what I have to say, what I feel I might be able to say, and what I feel I'm have a commitment to say. And from there forward, I think there's certain repercussions in the work, but I think the idea is that the work has to have a certain quality and a certain honesty and genuineness in terms of the experiences that I've had, because it's through those experiences that we have more relevancy, or I don't know, more knowledge to be able to speak and to be able to share and to react against people who might try to blame you for something. Thank you, Abigail. We have two more questions. The time is a little bit short, but let's see if anybody wants to answer. The first is from Gabriel Sosa. The role of repetition and of oscillation has been an important part of the conversation tonight. For the three of you, or anybody who wants to answer, is there any kind of ritual or routine that you have to get into in order to be able to produce your work? I can respond to that easily, because for me, I'm a person, I am a super routine and ritual-based person, especially in relation to my work. So for instance, before, I used to have the habit of repeating things 3 times. So many of the elements of my work. A lot of my work has to do with typing specifically. It has to do with repetition and with this kind of ritual, this sort of ritual that are part of our daily life, I think, and with a way of doing things. So for me, for instance, it's really important, this element of repetition, that it's not just a way of creating, it's also a topic that I want to research. And ritual itself, the moment of entering the studio to think or to read or to make something, but something like there's a kind of mental state that you have to go in with, or at least I like to go in with. So for me, that's super important. It's a moment. There are moments of creation, not always. And it's not that all pieces are produced in the same way and they don't all result in the same thing, right? But there is a huge portion of my work that has to do with rituals and with how things are done. But I don't know if that's, maybe I'm like too, I don't know, we take clavada in El Salvador, that things have to be done in a certain way. Like I'm too rigid. They have to be done a certain way. So maybe that's really important for me.
Gracias.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else wants to answer that question. I think I don't have a ritual per se, but the fact that I do photography, it's a practice that requires certain steps that are similar every time. So I think the ritual or routine that I enter into a lot of times is in the moment that I'm preparing my equipment. Maybe a day before, I have to charge the batteries for my camera. I have to clean my lens. This whole process, I'm always thinking about what I'm going to go photograph, who I'm going to go photograph. I'm trying to imagine the space that I'm going to come to, what are the options of shots I'm going to be able to have, etc. So for me, that's like my personal ritual. If I'm there with my equipment and how do I treat it? I'm cleaning it. I'm putting it in the bag. I'm setting it aside to be able to leave my house. And this would be, for me, one of the rituals that I create. And when I come home, of course, seeing the photographs and choosing which I'm going to use, right, to show, etc. It's like a process from the beginning to the end. And once the photograph is published, it's like also being attentive to comments, how people are perceiving it, etc. So that's part of everything. It's a constant and repetitive process.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Arshia, ¿te gustaría contestar esta pregunta?
Arshia, do you want to answer this question, or we can go to the next question?
Even though I do work with the subject of ritual a lot, my process is pretty chaotic, so there isn't really a specific answer that I have for this.
Gracias.
Thank you. Cristian Moises Mendez asks, this is a question for Liliana. How has the aesthetic of your project changed with the pandemic? It's changed quite a bit. I think you might call it like it's a branch. I've formed a branch of the same project. This is what I was mentioning during my talk, that it's called Lenchas y Marimachas en casa, Lenchas y Marimachas at home, because since the pandemic started, like everyone, I've been a little bit desperate because I can't go out of the house, a little bit thinking about what am I supposed to be doing as an artist, as an activist. A lot of times I feel the responsibility to be commenting on what's happening around me and to be sort of spinning my wheels about what is it that I have to document and how am I going to document it? What do I have to tell? What story do I have to tell? So based on the original project, I started to create a habit of saying, okay, we exist to see news reports, to see statistics about cases, about infected people, about deaths that started to increase. On the border, we get news from both countries. And within all of those statistics and all of those news channels, I realized that families with lesbian parents or families with same-sex parents or queer people, trans people, and how might they be affected by this pandemic? So based on that, I wanted to open the spectrum of representation a little bit, and I started to include women who don't have an appearance or a self-representation that's masculine, and to create this format where I would go to their houses or 2 meters away from them, and that they would wear with their masks. I would take take a photo of them in front of their house to be able to create visibility and a representation that we exist during the pandemic, that we continue to exist. We are people in resistance. We have existence. We might be single. We might be partnered, all the different ways that we are working or living or surviving from home in this moment. No? And that's what I've been working on since March, exactly. On that, in this element of the project where I'm documenting a little bit differently and with a little bit broader representation. So it has changed because it's not that same kind of one-on-one interaction with the people who I was photographing before. It's more like one photo, but it's also allowed me to create these representations and to include more people from different cities from around the Republic, from around Mexico.
Muchas gracias, Liliana.
And we're going to close
Pregunta para
with
Abigail.
a question for Abigail.
Tu próximo proyecto
What is
y
your
continuar
next project?
trabajando el contenido
And are you
alrededor
going to
de
continue exploring content about women?
Estás en mute.
You're on mute.
Gracias.
Thank you. Okay, so yes, I'm going to continue exploring subject matter around women. I'm always going to be interested in working with those topics, those themes. And my next project, or my most recent project, is a little bit complicated to talk about recent projects because I take many years to develop a project. So my most recent project, which is still not in the phase of, I try out lots of things. I do that all the time. I make tests. To just discover things in the process, things that what might interest me. Where could I do a little bit more? How might the project, or where should I stop an exploration? Also, it has to do with a question of popular culture, which is also in telenovelas, which I continue to be interested in. But this time it has to do with the logos or insignias of soccer teams, particularly the European leagues that are common in El Salvador. And so how it is that those symbols or these teams represent, well, okay, so the idea of the team is concretized in their brand, in their logo. So how do they represent certain values, certain ethical questions also, but the impact that it creates on our society, and I think in Central America in general, and how people feel identified with those teams and with those symbols. So what I'm doing is, this is since a couple of years ago, it's a slow project. I'm taking those symbols, I'm redesigning them in some way to try to talk about the history of El Salvador. we've minimized our own history. For instance, a killing of students in 1975 when the Salvadoran Civil War began. Also, there was a law that was signed in 1999, 98 at the end of the war, which was also an accord, political content, where any form of abortion was also penalized. So there's a ton of obstetric complications that are now penalized legally. And there are women who are in prison for 33 years because they had an OBGYN complication. And it's declared that it was an abortion, and now they have to be in prison for however many years. So to talk about this kind of thing, so to take a symbol from a European team and to create a kind of fictitious institution and to play also with the question of the visibility of these problems through a question or symbols or forms that are super well known, because who's not going to know these, who's not going to know the Barcelona soccer team, who's not going to know different teams, so because they're everywhere. So it's a little bit mixing these two concepts. And also I'm exploring a little bit, and here we're going to return to exercise as part of my education. I'm doing some textbooks and doing an exploration, but it's really, really at the beginning of how charts are drawn that we had to repeat, where there's a beautiful, beautiful handwriting, like a gorgeous calligraphy and gorgeous handwriting, and how it's also a kind of mechanization of the human body. So that's where I'm heading. Thank you so much, Abigail. And okay, I'm just going to remind you in the chat that you can see the link of the show if you haven't seen it. I'd also like to thank once again Arshia, Liliana, and Abigail for accompanying us this evening, the team at LACE, and all of the people who made this possible, and each of the people who were accompanying us here this evening. And thank you so much for having been here. And we invite you once again to come to the show. It'll be up until the 15th of December. Thank you so much.